Hi, everyone. I just wanted to go over how you would read a file into R. I'm going to give you guys a few options on how to do that. So I pulled the data from the CDC website on COVID-19 case surveillance data. And this data is public use. So if you type in this website, you'll be able to go and get the same exact data. I've already saved it to my computer and I've put it into a file, but instead of having to type the whole extension, I can use this file.choose option in R. And when I run that, screen pops up and it asks me where I want to look for the data. So I can go to my computer and I saved it to my desktop and then stat60A and then data. And there it is. So by double clicking that, I'm assigning my file to be the extension. So in R, if I were to type out my file, I would be able to see that it is where I have my data set saved. So C, users, camera, desktop, stat680A, data, COVID-19 case surveillance public use data.csv. So essentially I'm telling R where my file is saved. Now, alternatively, if I didn't want to use that file.choose function and I knew where my data was saved, then I could just do two pieces, which I like to do, is I could do read path, and that's where I'm reading my path, where my path is coming from. So I'm going to do everything except for that COVID-19 case surveillance data. And then the file path, I'm going to take, let's call that file name. I'm going to take as just the name of the file. Okay. So I have two different options here. And if I run the read path and the file name, that's going to save it to R. And I got an error, which we'll be able to fix in a second. Okay. Oh, it's because I have two quotations. I apologize for that. So for the read path, it's now corrected because I don't have two quotes. So sometimes it's all about troubleshooting. You have to be very particular. Okay. If I run this read path again, there's no error. If I type in read path, that will show me what read path stands for. And then if I run the file name, then the file name is just going to be the second part of the file name. Okay, so to read this data into R, I have two different options. My first option would be to use the my file, because if you remember, my file was everything. It was the entire path plus the name of the file. So if I do data gets, that's a less than sign and a minus sign, read.csv, my file, I'm telling it, use the function read.csv to read in my file. So when I run that, data is now being stored as that entire data set. If I want, I can look at the first 10 rows of the data by using these square brackets. It's rows, comma, columns. So when I say 1 to 10, that's saying, let me look at the first 10 rows of my data set. I generally like to do this when I read in a data set to make sure that it got read in correctly. Okay, so here's the first 10 rows of our data. We can see that we have different variables in there. CDC case earliest date, CDC report date, current status, sex, age group, race, ethnicity combined, hospitalization, YN, ICU, YN, death, YN, medical condition, YN. The YN in these cases is standing for yes or no. Okay. If I summarize my data, that will give me a very quick summary of what this is. And if you see, it just shows length class mode. And this is because all of these happen to be character variables. We don't have any numeric variables in here, which is okay, but don't be surprised when you see something like this. If you had a quantitative variable, it should give you the 5-number summary, your min, quartile 1, median, quartile 3, and your max, as well as the average. All right. So my second option for running in the data would be that instead of using my file here, I could think of putting in the read path plus the file name pasted together. So I'm going to do a function within a function. So if you've ever taken a math class, this is like composition functions, G of f of x, where G is the read.csv function, and then the f is going to be my paste function. So I'm going to use the function paste 0, and I'm going to give myself some parentheses. So that says paste two things together, and I'm going to paste together my read path and my file name. And just to double check that I'm doing this correctly, I could just highlight that one part. I could right click and I could go run liner selection. Now, since I'm in traditional R on a PC, the shortcut would be Control R. If you're using RStudio, the shortcut will be Control Enter. If you're using RStudio on a Mac, it should be Apple Enter, but by right clicking, you'll be able to see the shortcut for your particular computer. So when I run the liner selection, you'll notice that this is the same exact thing that the file.choose gave me. And there's some reasons behind separating out your read path and your file name, which will become more obvious with the more data sets that you use, or you could possibly be reading in multiple files that all come under the same read path. So you might want to get in a habit of putting these two together. Now, I am going to change the name of the data to just be data 2. And then we can look at the first 10 rows of this data set. It should be exactly the same as it was before because we're really calling the same file, but it becomes a matter of preference of how you like it. So we do a quick spot check. And we see that we're looking at the same data. We could also, instead of looking at the summary, we could look at the dimension of the data. That's going to give us the number of rows and number of columns. So here we have over 1 million rows of data with 12 columns. And so we see that we have a fairly large data set, but we've successfully ran the code such that we could read in a file and then have two different options. One option would be figuring out where your file is saved and actually hard coding, typing out where the read path is and what the file name is. The first option was that you could use this file.choose function, which will open up a window so you can just double click where your file is saved. And when you're first starting, I think option 1 makes it the easiest, whereas the longer and longer you code, you'll probably start to use the read path in the file name. Now, suppose I wanted to create a third data set. Let's just call it mail.data, okay? So create a new data set. We could say mail.data gets, and then we can subset our data. It doesn't matter at this point if we use data or data 2 because they're the same exact data set. And I'm going to say which data $sign sets equals mail. And by doing that, I should have a smaller data set. So we could just check the dimension of mail.data. Because this new data set should only be the males in the data set. All right, 1,014,754. Okay, so that tells me that the majority of people in this data set were males because we didn't subset off that many males. If we do table male.data $sex, they should all be male. Whereas if we did table data $sex, right? Just as a quick spot check, we see that we had mostly males, right? A few missing and a few who selected other in this particular data set. So hopefully this will give you a framework to start importing your data. But one thing that's just as important as importing data would be to export data. So I'm going to now export my data. And suppose that essentially I wanted to only have the male COVID-19 data and I wanted to get rid of the missing or the other data. For some reason. And what I could do here is I could use a new function called write.csv. So to import the data, we were saying read.csv, but to export the data, we're going to say write.csv. And I want to export mail.data. And now I need to put the file name into which I want to export. So I want to put it back into the same read path that I had been in. But now instead of file name, which was called COVID-19 case surveillance public use data.csv, I'm going to just copy that over. I'm going to paste it in. Okay. I'm going to say that I want to call this male COVID-19 case surveillance data. So I could either have copied and pasted this whole piece here, or since we're using the paste 0 command, which is pasting everything together, I could have just said male, and then I could go back and just write file name, because that's what we had called the COVID-19 case surveillance public use data.csv. So now I'm pasting together 3 pieces. I'm pasting together the read path, mail, and the file name. And I'm going to add one more option, which is row.names equals false. And essentially how this says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 for the participants, I don't want that to write it to the file. So I'm saying, please don't give me the row names in my file. And what I do here is I'm going to just spot check my files just so you guys can see that there was nothing in the folder called that. So if I go to my stat680A and my data, you can see that I only have one data set in there so far, the COVID-19 case surveillance public use data. That's what I imported in. But after running this line of code to export the data, when I do that, it's working. And I should see an arrow come up when it's finished. A large file, so it took a while. Now here's that arrow. And when I look back in this folder, I now have a new data set, which I called male COVID-19 case surveillance public use data. And if you notice, it's a slightly different size. That's totally fine. We're not surprised by that. But now I have 2 data sets. So for future analyses, I could use either one of these data sets, or I could continue to work in my R script. Okay, essentially what I'm going to do here is I'm going to highlight everything we've done. And I'm going to go over to RStudio in case you're someone who really likes RStudio. I personally don't use RStudio that much, but there's benefits. If you notice, when I look into this file, things are beautifully colored. There's a slightly nicer layout. My lines are noted in terms of my code. My console down here is similar to what I had before. So I'm going to give you just one more view. So here is the old school non-automatic filled in. I'm just typing in a script editor and I have my console. RStudio gives you a prettier, flashier version and has some differences that we're not going to discuss right now, but it is available. But essentially here, I now, since I'm working in RStudio, remember I said that if you right click, you can say run liner selection. Okay, here it doesn't even have it as an option in this version of RStudio, but since I've highlighted it, I can actually click run and we should still see the same results popping up. I have a command window that popped up at the bottom. And if I do that, I'm going to go through the same process that I did before, which was go to my desktop, Stat680A, data, and I can double click the COVID-19 case surveillance public use data set. And if I double click that, it goes. And if I go to my file, I can press Control Enter, or I could manually with my mouse click run. See, run over here says Control Enter, whereas before it was Control R. So you just have to know what your keyboard shortcuts are based on if you're in RStudio or if you're in R, or if you're on a PC or a Mac. On a Mac, it's going to end up being Apple Enter, I believe. Okay, but on a PC, Control Enter. So here it tells me my file is now saved as this whole piece. If it's on your computer, it should say something completely different because you don't have necessarily the same file path as I have. Okay. Now, one thing that I didn't mention yet is that you can either use these double slashes or you could use a single slash, but it has to go in the other direction. And this will work equally well. So it is up to your preference what you like to do. So if I did read path, it should run just fine. If I do file name, it should run just fine. Here, I had a function within a function. If I don't like the look of that, I could create something else called myfile2. Doesn't matter what you call it, as long as it starts with a letter instead of with a number. And then here I can replace that with myfile2. Okay, so if I run myfile2, enter, it's there. If I press ls parentheses, that will show me everything that's in the brain or in our console of R. So here I have 4 things in RStudio. I have file name, my file, myfile2, and read path. If you notice, that's also on the right-hand side within RStudio. In regular R, that doesn't show up. So you have to be a little bit more aware of what R has in the global environment, whereas in RStudio, they tell you explicitly what's in your global environment. Okay, so I can run my data again. And as I do that, shows me the first 10 rows of my data. And if you notice up here in the global environment, it says you have a data set with that many observations and 12 variables. Okay, I can also summarize my data like I did before. I can read in the second data set, I can subset, and I can write to a CSV just like I did. So I hope this helps you read in a CSV into R and export a CSV from R into a file. Thanks for joining.